You're listening to an Ono Media podcast.
Good morning, and thanks for joining me for Rise in Crime, your morning caffeine hit all about crime. I'm Mama Jules, and in a previous episode, I mentioned Joshua Hunsucker. He's a 35-year-old North Carolina paramedic that's been accused of killing his wife with eye drops. Now, the reason I mentioned him in the April 7th episode about Jessie Krzyzewski, now she's a woman who was convicted of killing her employer with eye drops, I mentioned him because his story is kind of crazy. And you might remember Jessie's story. Okay, she was the caregiver for 62-year-old Lynn Hernan, and investigators believed Jessie used a large amounts of Visine to kill Lynn in order to benefit monetarily from her passing. Well, Joshua Hunsucker, he looked at Jessie and said, "Hold my beer," because he not only has been accused of killing his wife Stacy with eye drops, but now he's been accused of harming his daughter and harassing family members. So let's break this whole entire story down. Stacy and Joshua, who were high school sweethearts, welcomed their first daughter, Piper, into the world in February of 2013. But kind of during this joyous time, a fire broke out at their home, destroying almost all that they owned when Piper was just 5 months old. Then Stacy and Joshua had another beautiful baby girl named Willow in November of 2014. Now that joyous time also had upset because Stacy was admitted to the hospital for low heart rate. Her condition was tenuous and she spent several days in the ICU before returning home to her husband and 2 baby girls. But then, just 2 months after the ICU stay, Stacy was admitted to the hospital again in January of 2015 for low heart rate again. While in the hospital, Stacy suffered a cardiac arrest and was placed on a ventilator to help her breathe. Doctors again stabilized Stacy, and she returned home to her babies after several days in the hospital. But during her stay, doctors inserted a pacemaker into Stacy's heart to aid in her cardiac issues and hopefully improve her quality of life. The Hunsucker household seemed to kind of stabilize for a bit along with Stacy's health. But that was just from the outside looking in. I'm not so sure the house was that stable. In September of 2018, a high-profile murder occurred in the neighboring state of South Carolina. And again, it involves eye drops. I don't know what's up with these people, but this is another story that has eye drops involved. This time, 53-year-old Lena Clayton was arrested for the murder of her husband, Stephen. Now, she admitted in court that she drugged his drinks for 3 days straight with large amounts of Visine. This murder received tons of media attention because it just had some really bizarre elements, like the fact that Lana had Stephen's funeral in the backyard of their shared home. And also, Stephen was buried before an autopsy could be performed, and Lana also had a tragic past that included child abuse and a potential rape on a military base when she was just a young girl. And she also attempted to complete suicide during the investigation into Stephen's death. And of course, the final thing, there's always the money. Stephen and Lana had accrued some sizable assets, and Lana was being accused of destroying Stephen's will shortly before she poisoned him. She eventually went on and pled guilty to the murder. But during those initial first weeks of her arrest and the extensive reporting about the murder in September of 2018, that might have given Joshua a devious idea. Maybe Joshua, who was a paramedic, looked at Lana, who was a nurse, and he thought maybe they shared occupations and knowledge bases, so he can copy what she did. Or maybe Joshua looked at Lana's husband, Stephen, and said, "Hey, he has similar health conditions to my wife, Stacy, so I could copy what Lana did." Or maybe he just thought he could adopt Lana's idea of poisoning with Visine. And it looks like his arrogant approach might have convinced only him that he could do better. Who knows? But just 2 weeks into the reporting about Lana killing Stephen with Visine, Joshua was calling 911 saying his wife was slumped over in their living room, unresponsive, not breathing, and blue in color. Stacy never recovered, and she died from what was initially ruled as a heart attack on September 23rd of 2018. She was just 32 years old, and her 2 daughters were just 5 and almost 4 years old. Now, when Joshua was asked questions about Stacy's death, this by officers on the scene, he said he didn't recognize that she was having a cardiac event because he was actually outside checking on their cars. He was making sure they were locked because he had heard there was a rash of car break-ins in the area, and he wanted to ensure his cars were okay, and that's how he missed his wife having a heart attack. But then later, Joshua told a friend that he had gone for a walk to burn off some energy, and that's how he missed his wife's medical emergency. And again, Joshua then allegedly told another friend that he wasn't even checking cars, he wasn't out walking, he was actually outside cutting some wood for signs that he was about to make. Okay, so there's 3 stories about the day Stacy died, but now there's a 4th. Susie Robinson, that's Stacy's mom and Joshua's mother-in-law. Well, she told investigators that Joshua said he was sitting at the kitchen table working on his computer when Stacy, just feet away from him, experienced the cardiac event. He allegedly told Susie that his back was to Stacy, and when he turned around, he saw her slumped over the side of the couch, and that's when he called 911. Now, during the initial hours of the investigation, Joshua refused to allow an autopsy, allegedly telling authorities he did not want his wife to, quote, be cut up. Now, Stacy, however, was registered as a potential organ donor with Life Share Donor Center. And so while Stacy lay dying that day in the hospital, they took blood samples and delivered them to this organ donation site. Stacy, however, was registered as a potential organ donor with Life Share Donor Center. And so medical personnel, during that time she was dying in the hospital, well, they took a blood sample. This in order to begin the process of matching possible donations. But Joshua kind of sidestepped that process, and instead he had his wife's body cremated as soon as possible. And then Joshua collected $250,000 from a life insurance policy that he had taken out on his wife, Stacy. All right, Susie, that's Stacy's mom. She was seeing red flags everywhere. She knew about the varying accounts of what had happened on the day of Stacy's death. She knew about the life insurance policy. And she also knew Joshua had begun dating almost immediately after Stacy's death. The dating happened so quickly, Susie told the Shelby Star that she thought the relationship was already hot and heavy before Stacy's death. Susie raised her suspicions to investigators, and that's when they realized they could test the blood sample. And what they found was shocking. The blood test results showed Stacy had a high level of tetrahydrozoline in her blood, 30 to 40 times higher than a therapeutic level. And high levels of tetrahydrozoline, which is contained in eye drops and nasal spray, well, it can cause vomiting and diarrhea and seizures and cardiac arrest, especially when someone already has cardiac issues. Investigators then began questioning more people, and they found out from Joshua's air rescue colleagues that Joshua seemed unfazed by his wife's death. Co-workers even told investigators that Joshua had stated 2 different times that if he was going to kill someone, he would use Visine. Now, all of that, paired with the fact that he almost immediately moved his girlfriend into the home he shared with his wife, that had many people raising eyebrows at Joshua's behavior. During the investigation, Joshua began having employment issues. His work behavior had allegedly become erratic. In November of 2019, all right, that's a little more than a year after Stacy's death, Joshua was working with Atrium Health as a paramedic on the medical helicopter. And during a flight, Joshua became unstable and he allegedly torched a syringe pump. The fire aboard the flight caused the pilot to make an emergency landing in an auto dealership parking lot. And Joshua was then put on administrative leave, and his employee history was being evaluated by Atrium Health when Joshua was arrested. This for his wife's death, and he was charged with first-degree murder. Investigators believed he had poisoned his wife with tetrahydrozoline in order to cash in on her life insurance policy and also to move his girlfriend into his home. His bond was set at a staggering $1.5 million, but he somehow posted the required amount, and then he went on living his life. So all of this is happening in December of 2019, and then COVID-19 lockdowns took over for the next 2 years. And if we've learned anything here on Rise in Crime, Those lockdowns all but halted progress on any high-profile trial. And Joshua went on with his life, but his alleged antics just kept piling up. In February of 2023, Joshua alerted authorities that he had been the victim of an alleged kidnapping. He told authorities that he had stopped in Mount Holly, North Carolina to change a flat tire. He said while he was repairing his car that a man approached him and pistol whipped him in the head several times. He said the kidnappers then zip-tied his hands and that they injected an unknown substance into his body. Well, Joshua told investigators that it was his former father-in-law, John Robinson, who had attempted to kidnap him. After that investigation by Mount Holly Police Department, they determined that Joshua was making the whole thing up. In an affidavit, investigators lined out that it was quite the opposite of what Joshua was reporting. They discovered that Joshua was allegedly harassing his former in-laws and not the other way around with John kidnapping Joshua. The affidavit states that Joshua sent John and Susie Robinson an intimidating package that instructed them to not press any more charges against him. Joshua also allegedly had been following John and Susie to church and then to lacrosse practices for his daughter. Now, while at the lacrosse practices, he would use a GoPro to film Susie and John in the attempts to gather footage of them to use in court. John and Susie also told the authorities that Joshua would make vulgar gestures at them when they crossed over with him in public. And sadly, the affidavit says that Piper and Willow witnessed their father doing these vulgar gestures. But it gets worse, you guys. The affidavit also states that nearly the same time that Joshua was claiming he was kidnapped, he was allegedly poisoning his daughter. On February 23rd of last year, authorities claimed that Joshua poisoned his oldest daughter, Piper, by putting tetrahydrozoline into her water bottle. Piper drank that water and became ill. 2 days later, doctors collected a urine sample from Piper, and they discovered that she had elevated levels of tetrahydrozoline. They also discovered that Piper had venlafaxine in her urine. All right, that's a drug used to treat depression in adults. Piper was 10 years old at the time. She shouldn't have had that drug in her system. While she was hospitalized at Levine's Children's Hospital, she suffered from a low heart rate, extreme exhaustion, and constricted blood vessels. During the hospitalization, Joshua told authorities he thought his former in-laws were the ones poisoning his daughter the way that they had poisoned Stacy 5 years previous. Okay, that's right. He's telling investigators that his in-laws killed his wife with Visine, and now they're poisoning his daughter, their granddaughter. All right, we have one more important part in this new situation. During that whole I was being kidnapped claim by Joshua, cops had discovered that very same depression drug in Joshua's truck. So he's been found to be in possession of the adult-only drug that is found in his 10-year-old's urine sample results. Well, in early July of this year, during a family court hearing, it was determined that Joshua had neglected and abused his daughters, Piper and Willow. This has led to his former in-laws taking over the care of the two girls exclusively. Then on Tuesday, Gaston County officials arrested Joshua again. His charges are just racking up. We've got first-degree murder for Stacy's death. We have insurance fraud for the $250,000 he received after her death. We have arson charges for the fire on the helicopter. And now we have him faking a kidnapping and abusing his daughters and receiving charges for those alleged actions. He was back in court on Friday to face the new charges. Prosecutors requested his bond be revoked, and right now, he remains incarcerated because the judge agreed. Joshua, for his part, requested a public defender for his new charges because his assets are all tied up in the civil suit filed by John and Susie and in the first-degree murder charges. His next court appearance on the new charges will occur in October. Stacy's family was at the hearing on Friday, but they didn't speak afterward. Instead, their lawyer released the following statement. From the Robinsons' perspective, safety is paramount for their family and their grandkids. They are thankful and appreciative of the district attorney and the continued effort to investigate and seek justice for Stacy. No date has yet to be set for the murder trial. Motions on testing the blood That's delayed the trial for months. So I'll be watching to see what happens in this case, and I'll let you know when I know more. But before we're done with this, let's remember Stacy, who was a lifetime member of the Mount Holly First United Methodist Church. She worked as both a preschool teacher for the First Baptist Charlotte Preschool and also as a paralegal. She loved crafting, also visiting the beach and watching sports. Hopefully, Piper and Willow are thriving in this tragic situation. All right, now an update to a story from February of 2023, where a hulking Florida teen brutally pummeled his high school teacher, leaving her with permanent damage. Brendan Deppa, who is now 18 years old, is 6'6", 270 pounds. He looks like a man-child, and he's been clinically diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Now, he has above average intelligence in some areas, like computer skills, and he would attend classes with the general education students in those subjects like computers. But then in other areas, he would receive special education away from the general studies. Well, on that day in February, Florida teacher Joan Neidish was feeling a little uneasy in her classroom. She had been employed in the education system for 2 decades as a cafeteria worker before she pushed through her education and became a paraprofessional in the Flagler County School District. Now, the job allowed her to stay close to her 2 children while they were being educated in the same district. Joan had met Brendan before. More than a year earlier, Joan had worked with Brendan in the special needs classroom, helping him transfer to various destinations and then also complete certain tasks throughout his school day. Well, Brendan has a reputation. If he became agitated, he allegedly would throw items at Joan and other staff members. He also frequently referred to teachers and aides as either the B word or some variation of that derogatory name. But Joan said she never really felt physically threatened by Brendan. She said he would try to intimidate with his size, but most of his bad behavior was verbal in nature. She said she had even held advanced conversations with Brendan about his possibilities of attending college, exploring brochures from Bethune-Cookman University. That's a historically Black college in Daytona Beach. But then on other occasions, he would become agitated with her, telling her to stop spying on his school file. She told the New York Post that she was scared on that specific day, and she felt like she needed to exit the classroom. The day had started with Joan waiting for Brendan to arrive in the van that transported him from his group home. Brendan was no longer allowed to ride the public school bus because his riding privileges had been revoked for fighting with another student. When he was dropped off at the high school campus that morning, he was already frustrated. And it became worse when he had to wait for other students to be escorted by Joan to the cafeteria for breakfast. Brendan told Joan he hadn't gotten dinner the night before, so he was really hungry and he wanted his breakfast without delay. After breakfast, Brendan was walked to his special needs classroom. During that class hour, his regular teacher would routinely promise Brendan that he could use his Nintendo Switch once he had completed all of his academic tasks. However, on this exact day, Brendan had a substitute teacher. Joan was aware this could possibly trigger some potentially negative behaviors by Brendan, so she volunteered to stay near Brendan and aid the substitute if needed. Brendan, before completing his tasks, had pulled out his Switch and began playing and also distracting other students with the video game device. Joan asked him to put it away, and he obliged, but he brought the Switch back out later in the classroom hour. Now, in a proactive move, Joan texted the next hour's teacher and alerted that teacher to Brendan's heightened preoccupation with the device on that day. But here's the problem. Brendan figured out that Joan had texted his next teacher, and that infuriated him. So he started calling Joan names like the B word and whore. As the 59-year-old paraprofessional exited the classroom, Brendan followed her to the door where he spat in her face. Joan rushed into the hallway, but so did Brendan, and that's when he began attacking her. He pushed her to the ground and punched her more than a dozen times in her face and head, and he kicked her repeatedly during the attack. The whole attack was caught on video surveillance. And if you want to find it out there, you can go get it. It's been viewed millions of times. But in that video footage, you can see that Joan is unconscious during most of the beating. It takes 4 grown adults to pull Brendan away from Joan. Even after the adults yank Brendan from the attack, he breaks free again and he continues to kick Joan. As the attack was happening, Joan's son, who was a senior at the high school at the time, well, he was in the classroom next door. When the ambulance arrived to transport Joan to the hospital for treatment, her stunned son was pulled from class, and he was asked to ride along with his bruised and beaten and psychologically harmed mother. Well, for more than a year, Joan has received mental and physical care to combat the wounds that were inflicted that day. Joan has never returned to the classroom to work as a paraprofessional. Brendan was charged with felony aggravated battery, and last week he received his sentence after pleading guilty. As the judge read aloud that Brendan would be sentenced to 5 years in prison, Brendan, in his orange jumpsuit, threw his head back in disbelief, or maybe it was frustration, or maybe it was anger. I couldn't really tell, but he clearly does not like what the judge is saying. During the sentencing hearing, his adoptive mother, Leanne Deppa, asked that Brendan just be allowed to return home to live with her. She said the school system had failed Brendan and that they had not properly handled his autism diagnosis. After the sentencing, she told reporters that the judge and prosecutors were seeking punishment for Brendan simply because he was Black. She told the Daytona Beach News-Journal that Brendan was being punished because he's large in stature and that he's disabled. She said she feels like he needs help and some sort of treatment instead of going to prison. She's worried he will be taken advantage of while he serves out his sentence. She said the following: I had told the school that being hungry was a trigger, that noise was a trigger, that being told no was a trigger, that being corrected in front of other people was a trigger, and electronics was a huge trigger. Brendan's attorney wanted Brendan to be tried as a juvenile since he was 17 at the time of the attack. But Assistant State Attorney Melissa Clark argued that the teen had a history of violence and that he needed to be treated as an adult due to the severity of his previous actions and also the charges. And I think it's important to note that Brendan did have multiple recorded physical interactions with people inside and outside the school system. Joan had previously told the judge that Brendan's action had caused her to lose her employment, lose her financial security, and lose her health insurance. She said that her life will never be the same since that attack at 10 a.m. in February of 2023. Well, Brendan could have received up to 30 years in prison, so his sentence was much less than the law could have allowed. Brendan can appeal the sentencing, but not the conviction since he pled guilty to the charges. Joan is still battling with the school district over workman's comp from the incident. And finally, let's stick in Florida because that state provides us with an endless stream of wacky crime stories, and this one doesn't disappoint. 71-year-old Robert Collin was arrested and charged last week after lassoing a 9-foot alligator and tying that alligator to a handrail, and then he fled the scene. All right, this all went down in Cape Canaveral when authorities were alerted by Robert, they were alerted by Robert himself, that he had discovered an alligator tied to a handrail over a canal. He didn't tell the authorities he was the one who had done the lassoing. He just simply called them at 7:30 in the morning and reported that the reptile was tied up, and then he fled the scene. But surveillance footage from a nearby building owned by SpaceX showed Robert creating a loop with a nylon cord. He then dangled that loop, which trapped the alligator, and then he tied the reptile to the handrail with the reptile still suspended in the water. But here's the deal. Those reptiles are protected in Florida. And so Robert was charged with illegal killing, possessing, or capturing of an alligator. Robert posted his bond of $2,500, and then he explained his reasoning behind the lassoing. He said that he was trying to protect turtles that he feeds in the canal, and he said he had seen and reported alligators to authorities before that day, but he finally took matters into his own hands, creating that trap for the alligator, and then tying the alligator to the handrail. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you feel about gators, the reptile was euthanized by order of the sheriff's office. Well, that's your Monday episode of Rise and Crime. Thanks for being part of this community, for listening and watching however you get the content, whether it be by YouTube or Apple Podcast or Spotify or any other platform. I truly appreciate you joining me on this journey. And if you're loving the content, please share it with a friend. And we love 5-star reviews and positive comments. And you can like and follow us on all of our social media or YouTube accounts. Please comment there. It helps the podcast and YouTube broadcast grow. You can join me again on Thursday for more morning crime news. I'm Mama Jules, and keep safe out there.